Hello, everyone. Welcome to A History of Mexican Immigration to the United States by Dr. Coan, Professor of History Emeritus, Tunxis Community College. Thank you so much, Dr. Coan, for being here. I am going to turn the program now over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, for the invitation, the opportunity to present to your patrons once again. And I enjoy working with you as much as you enjoy working with me, believe me. They're a pleasure to work with. And thank you to those on the Zoom meeting and those who may see this after the fact also. So obviously this can only be an overview of a really large topic. There are a lot of details to this, so I am really trying to look at the key elements, kind of turning points of this history. But if you saw the promo for this program, there are certain factors that really explain this pattern of immigration, long-standing and large-scale. Geography is one, economics is certainly another, and then politics. I think it's really those three things primarily. You can throw in other factors, which we'll talk about, what geographers call push and pull factors that cause immigration and cause people to leave one place and come to another. But I think it's really those three factors primarily that explain this relationship, as it were, between Mexican immigrants and the United States. So let's get started. In 1856, a Mexican, at that time now, a Mexican-American statesman named Pablo de la Guerra in the California Assembly gave this speech in which he used this phrase, foreigners and their own land. And it's actually a title of a book that's very, very good, that looks at the early history of Mexican Americans. So I definitely want to capture that phrase, because what he was doing is explaining what happened to Mexicans during this period between Mexican independence and the Mexican-American War. So let's talk about that. Mexico only won its independence from Spain in 1821. And within a generation, we see that map of Mexico, which looks kind of large as compared to the map of Mexico today. Within a generation, the Mexicans would lose about 55% of their territory to the United States. So that greater Mexico didn't last very long. And this really happened in two stages. The first stage was, well, the Mexicans made a mistake, at least in retrospect. I think they might have considered this a mistake. In the 1820s, what's now Texas was not populated by many Mexicans. It was mainly Native Americans, primarily them. And it was a relatively sparsely populated area. So in 1824, the Mexican government entered into a treaty with Moses Austin, who's a native of Durham, Connecticut, to bring a group of American families to settle Texas. And that began really a flood of families coming. Again, under Mexican auspices. They wanted that land settled and, as they would consider it, civilized and brought under control and developed. And their hope was these settlers would become good Mexican citizens. Well, it didn't work that way. Immediately, they clashed with the Mexican government. And keep in mind, the Mexican government was really in Mexico City, hundreds of miles across desert and very difficult terrain. So long story short, without getting into the whole history in detail here, in 1835, these Texans would rebel against the Mexicans and engage in a short but very bloody war. The Alamo is the most famous moment of that conflict. And in 1836, forced the Mexican government to recognize their independence. So actually, for the next 9 years, Texas was a republic. It was its own country, believe it, until in 1845, the United States annexed Texas as a state. What held up that annexation was a debate over slavery, because the Texans, in their constitution, wanted to become a slave state and would become a slave state. But because of the controversy over slavery, it took 9 years for Congress to agree to annex Texas. At any rate, that was the first chunk of Mexican territory that was lost. 1846, a war breaks out. The Mexican War, or Mexican-American War, between the United States and Mexico. And primarily this was driven by manifest destiny. This was driven by the Americans wanting to link the country sea to sea, build a transcontinental railroad, and develop a port along the western coast, probably San Francisco, they had their eyes on, but maybe LA, that Long Beach, for trade with Asia. So grandiose terms or ideas. The Mexicans didn't want to sell any territory, especially after losing Texas. And so ultimately this led to war. And it was really a war at the behest of the United States. The Polk administration, James Polk, really engineered this war to a large extent. I don't think there's any other interpretation that makes sense. So after 2 years, the United States ends up winning a huge victory, not easily, but nonetheless, against the Mexicans. The Mexican government agrees to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and for $15 million, ultimately, the Mexicans gave this territory to the United States, which the United States had conquered. So the question becomes, what happened then to the Mexican citizens in these two territories, particularly after 1848, and what had been Mexican Texas, and then what had been what's called Alta Mexico, or Alta California, Upper California. Well, under the treaty, those people had a choice. They could either remain Mexican citizens, meaning probably they go back to Mexico. And a minority did that, but the vast majority became American citizens under this treaty. And technically, under the treaty, this is a quote from one of the clauses in the treaty, they had all the rights of citizens of the United States. That was guaranteed them under this treaty. There are actually other clauses that guarantee more specific rights. The problem being, this map is taken from Pew Research, which I'll mention at the end, has a tremendous website dealing with immigration, both historical and current. So this map is from 1860. It's based on census data. And what you see is the United States broken down by state or territory. And where you see China, for example, that would indicate in 1860, the largest number of foreign-born people in California were Chinese. In Texas, they're German. So I'm making the point that this idea of rights of citizens, that was fine perhaps initially, where the Mexicans were in the majority, but very, very quickly they became a minority, except in what would become New Mexico and Arizona, this area. And Texas, even before the Texas Revolution, they were not, the Mexicans were the minority. The Anglos moved in there in such large numbers, and foreign peoples too, from Europe, that the Mexicans became a very small minority. The same thing would happen in California too. And once they became a numerical minority, they would become subject to discrimination. And the primary way they were dispossessed of their political power is most of them over time were dispossessed of their land. If they were landholders, that was not guaranteed under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So by hook or by crook, most Mexicans who own their own territory in the Mexican cession in Texas would lose it eventually to others. So this treaty that guaranteed their rights was not honored in most cases. And we should keep in mind, this wasn't done by the federal government. This was done by those new state and territorial governments to the Mexicans, and largely it was because they were a minority. If we go forward to the end of the 19th century, very early 20th century, keep in mind that the period roughly 1865 to 90 is the period of westward expansion in the United States, where not only people are moving west, they're developing the resources of the West, primarily mining and ranching being the big two. And the West was becoming linked to the East. So when I used to teach this in class, I describe it as something like a colonial relationship between the Western and Eastern United States, at least initially, where these weren't colonies, these were territories or states, but they were really supplying raw materials back east to the more populated parts of the country. And in return, by the way, finished goods are being sent the other way. But not only was the eastern part and the western part of the United States being linked by railroads primarily at this time, which were being built at a tremendous rate. The United States and Mexico were similarly being linked economically, primarily by railroads. And this was actually the program of this fellow you see here, President Porfirio Diaz, who ruled during most of this period, 1876 to 1910. His program is called Order and Progress. Diaz was essentially a dictator, but he welcomed foreign investment into Mexico because he realized this would be an effective way of developing the Mexican economy. But what that would lead to is as early as about 1890, it was the Americans right next door with money and with know-how who would actually control a large part of the Mexican economy, the railroads, mineral rights, ranches, farmland, some industry. Ultimately, this development occurred, but as we see in many parts of the world even today, it didn't benefit the lowest classes, the poorest people, certainly in Mexico. It tended to benefit the wealthy oligarchs who were in charge and who owned most of the property. So even as early as this period, there would be immigration to the United States, which I'll get to in a moment. And even during the Diaz regime, the Mexican elites saw mass immigration in two ways. Both as a disgrace, because it indicated to them that they hadn't been able to alleviate poverty in this country. There was mass poverty that would remain, and for long after this period would remain. But on the other hand, they also saw it as a safety valve, where poor people who might become disillusioned, who might decide to join revolutionary groups, would leave the country and they wouldn't have to worry about them. They'd go somewhere else, in this case, of the United States. And that dualism remains even to this day, to some extent, in terms of Mexican policy. On the one hand, I don't think it looks well if you're sending millions of people out of your country, because then it indicates there's something wrong in terms of economic opportunity or social stratification or what have you. But on the other hand, it's a relief not to have to worry about those people, to try to find jobs for them, or to worry about them rebelling against your government, causing turmoil. Prior to 1900, Mexicans in America were very heavily concentrated in the Southwest, really what would become four states: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. It's not to say there were no Mexicans beyond those places, but the very large majority were there. And they were there primarily in rural regions, not so much cities yet, although by 1900, they were moving into towns and cities. And if they were working in the railroads, where actually there were a majority of the railroad track crews, believe it or not, in the United States, working on ranches or working in mines. Those were really the three primary employers of Mexicans in the United States. And by the way, most of these Mexicans were from northern Mexico, had migrated from northern Mexico, where they engaged in the very same sort of work there. This pattern would begin to change about 1902. The Newlands Act was a really important federal program that invested money in irrigation of Western lands. So what this would do is this, in conjunction with a whole bunch of state programs that did the same thing on a smaller scale, would be to, if you will, make the desert bloom. California would become the garden state, really, starting about this period, producing enormous numbers or amounts of fruits and vegetables, not only locally, but obviously for Eastern markets, and eventually even beyond that. But the same thing would happen in other states too. Arizona would become a big cotton growing state. And you'd think, desert? Well, if you irrigate, yeah, you can grow cotton there, you can grow a lot of it. So what this would lead to now is the need for a larger agricultural workforce. And Mexicans increasingly would be recruited as part of that workforce. There were certainly native-born Americans who did this work, but Mexicans were another option, and they were happy to do it if they could get here because the wages were higher. Another important event in the middle here is the Mexican Revolution. So this would drive the first really large wave of Mexican migration to the United States. A lot of it was driven by the revolution itself, obviously the violence. But before and after the revolution too, poverty, mass poverty was there in Mexico. Governmental mismanagement of the economy, corruption, social stratification. But keep in mind, when I say the first large wave, when we're talking probably the better part of 1 million people came to the United States during this decade. Most of them did not stay. And that would be the pattern really until as late as the 1980s. Most of these migrants were itinerant. They would come here for a time. Typically, they were males. Typically, they'd come here for work. They'd earn a certain amount of money, a nest egg, and they'd go back to Mexico. And that would be true even during the revolution. Many of them simply fled the violence, and then when the violence abated, they went home. During World War I, the first Bracero Program. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the second program, which was much more large-scale, long-standing. But this was a program that actually invited in Mexican migrant farm workers to do labor during the war when there was a need for more labor, partly because the United States conscripted significant numbers of men into the military. So we'll come back and talk about the Bracero program when we do the second program, which was begun during the Second War. So just to summarize a little, between 1870 and 1900, the Mexican-born population, it more than doubled, but it took 30 years, and it was still only a little over 100,000. So we're talking from about here to about here. Between 1900 and 1920, there's a bigger increase, over fourfold, but we're still under 500,000. And then if you look at Mexicans as a percentage of all immigrants, all foreign-born peoples in the United States in 1920, it's maybe 4%. There's still a really small percentage of the immigrant population. And without getting into this in great detail, it's certainly before 1920, the vast majority of immigrants that came to the United States came from Europe. And by 1890, or certainly 1900, it was becoming less Northern and Western Europe and more Southern and Eastern Europe. But if you look here, 1890 to 1919, Latin America is just 3%. You know, it's not that many people coming even from Mexico into the United States. And again, many of them aren't staying. Most of them are going back. They're staying for a time, and then they're going back to Mexico. So the population would grow. It would grow kind of slowly, but it wouldn't grow explosively, certainly, during this period. And then what happened? Again, I did a presentation on this some years ago, but the 1920s, really the teens of the 20s, there is a radical change of immigration policy in the United States that was driven by, there's no question, it was bigotry, nativism, kind of a turning within, and a kind of wanting to keep the rest of the world at arm's length, particularly after World War I and the Versailles Treaty and kind of the disappointments that came from that. And eugenics, too. This idea of racial purity, that there were races, that race was scientifically based, that one could classify races, and there were more and less desirable races. All of that would lead to, again, large changes in immigration policy. And those changes are really these three laws. The 1924 National Origins Act being the final one. They were aimed primarily at keeping Asians from coming to the country, and that had largely been done even before 1900. And more than Asians even, certainly by the 1910s and 20s, Southern and Eastern Europeans, who were considered by the elite in the United States, the people in power, as not desirable, or much less desirable. So the door wasn't exactly closed to these people. It was almost closed to Asians entirely. But Southern and Eastern Europeans, there were strict quotas, very small quotas, yearly quotas. So you would think policies based on bigotry, nativism, eugenics would close the door to Mexicans, but they didn't. Actually, Mexicans were exempted from most of the elements of these laws. Why? It's called the lobbying efforts of American agricultural and economic interests. They lobbied Congress to make sure, particularly those people who use Mexican farm workers, that they could still get Mexican labor. So the door wasn't closed under these acts to Mexicans. They were really exempt from most of the provisions of these acts. As part of the 1924 National Origins Act, there was a separate bill, the Labor Appropriations Act. There was a Border Patrol created for the first time, actually, in the United States history. The states had had border patrols. The federal government had sent people there occasionally, but now this is the permanent border patrol that we have today. And actually, it's celebrating its 100th birthday, I guess, this year. Remember seeing anything about that, interestingly enough. But keep in mind, the Border Patrol, this was a period of relative federal austerity, too, was grossly underfunded and undermanned. It was only a few hundred agents actually to patrol both the Canadian and Mexican borders. The 1920s and 30s are sort of a contrast. Between 1920 and 30, Mexicans kept coming to the United States. And again, they're primarily coming to these 4 states in the Southwest, and they're primarily coming still as temporary farm laborers, coming to work, hopefully accumulate a nest egg, and go back to Mexico. But again, an ever-increasing number were actually not farm workers. They were settling in urban centers and becoming day laborers, or if they were fortunate, perhaps working in other businesses or industries, or even starting their own in some cases. And Los Angeles, really as early as the Mexican War, was the area most densely populated by Mexicans or Mexican Americans. And I think it still is today, actually. So the 20s, they're coming here, but what happened in 1929? Stock market crash, followed by the Great Depression. And now Mexicans aren't wanted in the United States because there was a collapse of farm commodity prices. There are programs such as the AAA that under the New Deal that actually were designed to take farmland out of production to drive up commodity prices. So there's this turning against migrant labor in this case. So actually Mexicans were deported by the hundreds of thousands from particularly California and Texas, and in some cases voluntarily repatriated. And actually, the Mexican government cooperated in this fact. This is a photo taken in 1931 from Los Angeles, where these people are actually bidding farewell to their relatives who have been repatriated back to Mexico. So during the period 1930 to 40, there's a marked decrease, 44%. Almost half of Mexicans in the United States were either deported back to Mexico or went back of their own volition. Just a couple of photos. This is taken in the Imperial Valley in the 1930s. This gives you some idea of how typically Mexican migrant laborers lived, the conditions. And I can remember this as late as the 70s, actually, being on shows like 60 Minutes, I think. No running water, no sanitation, ramshackle shacks. So this was hard living. But on the other hand, to these people, they were relatively better off than their opportunities would have provided them in Mexico. That's why they were here. This is actually a New Deal farm work camp, which was kind of state of the art with sanitation, running water, kind of order, dignity, and that sort of thing. All right, so we get to World War II and the Bracero Program. And I did look up bracero. Apparently, it's a take on the word brazo, which is arm in Spanish. So the idea, manual laborers, men working with their hands, farm laborers in this case. So this program was negotiated actually between the Mexican and American governments during World War II to alleviate shortages of farm labor in the United States. And if you know anything about World War II, the United States economy boomed because the United States was producing not only for its own military, we're talking like 15 to 16 million people under arms. It was providing lend-lease aid to every free power in the world, and it was feeding its own people and providing for them at the same time. So there was this enormous need for labor. And obviously, if you're putting 15, 16 million people, mostly men in uniform, there's going to be a labor shortage. So this included all sorts of provisions which were quite attractive to Mexican laborers, farm laborers who wanted to come to the United States. One would be wages 8 to 10 times higher than they could earn in Mexico for the same. Some measure of job security, protections against discrimination, which to be sure were largely ignored, improved living conditions, that didn't really happen. Payment of travel costs from and to Mexico. This photo was taken, by the way, in 1943 in Mexico City. These are all men lining up to try to enroll in this program and get to the United States. So was it popular? It sure was. And really what it was intended to do to a large extent was two things: to codify the system that already had come into play of Mexicans coming across the border, either as authorized immigrants or unauthorized, i.e. legally or illegally, to do farm labor and then going back at some. So it simply was meant to codify and rationalize that. And it was also aimed at reducing the number of unauthorized aliens. Let's do this in a way where they all come across legally. So the program would run from 1942 until 64, and ultimately 4.6 million, roughly, Mexican men, I think they were all men, so far as I know, would participate in this program. And again, even after the program ended, this pattern of Mexicans coming across, and they were primarily men, for work in the United States, temporarily going back to Mexico, it would continue. But the Bracero program had problems, even from the get-go. One couldn't simply get into the program. One had to apply to the program in Mexico through an agent There was a cost that not all Mexicans could afford. And what was assumed too is you would have to pay a bribe to get involved. That was common. There were not really effective border controls during most of this period. We could talk more about Operation Wetback during the 50s, kind of an infamous moment where the United States under the Eisenhower administration did decide to try to impose border controls and engaged in the largest deportation in US history. But that was sort of an aberration during this period. There weren't really effective border controls. Another thing is there were no sanctions for employers who hired unauthorized workers. None. Zero. There was nothing in federal law to sanction them. So what happened is the Bracero Program it ran parallel to this other program of simply employing unauthorized aliens who came across the border looking for work. And of course, the advantage to the employer was he could negotiate any terms he wanted. He wasn't bound by the terms of the Bracero. Ultimately, by the 60s, lobbying by Mexican American groups such as the United Farm Workers, mechanization of agriculture, which to some extent, a significant extent, was reducing the need for migrant labor. Not entirely, but was reducing it. And then evidence that this program actually lowered wages in the United States for farm workers caused the United States government to end the program. The Mexican government did not want to end this program, primarily because that safety valve effect, because for a period of almost a generation, really, millions of Mexicans had left the country, benefited from this program, and then in many cases come back to Mexico. One other thing we could mention here is remittances. Even those who didn't come back or while they were in the United States, many of them would send money back to their families. And that's a pattern that's persisted to this day. And that's a very significant part of the Mexican economy, with the money sent back by Mexicans in the United States to their families in Mexico. In 1965, another really important immigration act was passed. This is during the LBJ administration. This is the signing ceremony. And again, this was really meant to undo the acts of the 19 teens and 20s, especially the National Origins Act. And it would radically change US immigration policy. And by the way, this is really the cornerstone of the policy to this day, is this 1965 act. So those quotas were eliminated, those quotas that discriminated against Southern and Eastern Europeans and Asians. Now, there were quotas maintained per country and total quotas per year, but other than that, and there was initially a limit on number of immigrants who could come from the Western Hemisphere. But this law gave priority of becoming citizens or legal residents to relatives of US citizens and legal permanent residents. Almost 3/4 of the visas given would go to those people. Most of the rest to professional and skilled immigrants looking to fill voids in the American workplace, and then political refugees. 1980, there was actually a law passed that separated out refugees as a separate category, without getting into the details. But what this law would do ultimately, because there were already, by 1965, very significant numbers of Mexicans who would become US citizens or Mexicans who were legal permanent residents, is it would give them a large advantage in being able to sponsor relatives to come to the United States and get on the citizenship path. And this is from 1965 to 2024, these three great waves of immigration. And you certainly see, since 1965, Latin Americans have made up about half of all immigrants who have come to the United States. And about half of those have come from Mexico, not surprising. So again, you had this explosive growth of Mexican-born people in the United States after 1965, and especially after 1970, once this program was really set into motion. So you see the increase there up to almost 2.2 million people. Not only did the number of legal immigrants increase, though, the number of unauthorized entries. So this is as recorded by the Border Patrol, would increase in 1964, just 87,000, 1986, 3.8 million Mexicans were considered unauthorized entrants in that year. So yes, more Mexicans were here legally, but more Mexicans were also here who were not authorized to be here. And again, why is that? Well, many of the same factors. The border was still porous. It was not that difficult to get across the border. And keep in mind, smuggling goes back at least to the end of the 19th century. So even if one didn't know how to get across the border, if one could find a coyote, a smuggler, and one had some money, one could probably get across the border. There were still no sanctions on American employers hiring unauthorized aliens. The Mexican economy had actually done fairly well between World War II and 1970. By the 70s, it was running into serious problems. So that would lead to another group of people seeking greener pastures. And the United States, during most of this period, was relatively well off economically and certainly better off than Mexico. And then we throw in the war on drugs, which President Nixon declared in 1969 and really kind of got underway by the 70s. You know, that would focus yet more attention on the border, certainly from the United States perspective, but to some extent the Mexican perspective too. So 1986, after a lot of debate, let me go forward here. Well, let me go just about 1980. By about 1980, both the Democrats and Republicans, the majority of them, and most Americans, were really concerned about the border, you know, capital T, capital B, the Mexican-American border. Does this sound familiar? So this isn't exactly new. And they were certainly concerned about unauthorized immigration. And both parties agreed we need to do something. But it would still take several years for a bill to be crafted, negotiated, and passed. Actually, similar bills to what's called IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, died in the Senate, 1982 and 83. There were very similar bills, but they died. So finally, 1986, this bipartisan bill, comprehensive bill, passed. And it was truly bipartisan, believe it or not. It wasn't just one or two Republicans or Democrats. This had widespread support, although widespread opposition too in both parties. And here are the key provisions. So everybody got something, but nobody got everything he wanted. So greatly increased funding for the Border Patrol. So the Border Patrol would go from about 2,000 agents, I don't know if I have that in front of me, to over 12,000 within a few years. Massive increase. For the first time, penalties for American employers who knowingly hire unauthorized aliens. We'll come back to that. Very controversially, amnesty for long-term unauthorized aliens. And that was kind of spelled out. But if people had been here for some years and not left the United States, they were eligible for amnesty and to be put on a path to citizenship. And there was a separate legalization program for unauthorized agricultural workers. And that was, again, lobbying by the agricultural interests, primarily in Texas and California. Hey, you know, we need these people. So could you do a carve out for them? And that became part of the bill. And again, I'll reiterate, this was the last comprehensive sweeping immigration bill passed in this country. So that's 38 years now. And I'll advocate one position. this clearly is what the country needs again, is another comprehensive bill. What that's going to look like, and bipartisan. When that will pass, I don't know, but I see no way around it. It's got to happen at some point. So about 2.3 million Mexicans in the United States would take advantage of the amnesty under IRCA. And in many cases, they would obviously become U.S. citizens, and they'd be eligible to sponsor family members for U.S. citizenship. And what IRCA did, and I don't think this was intentional exactly, it was sort of a consequence of the law, was it transformed that pattern of itinerant migration to a pattern of more permanent migration. If for no other reason, to qualify for amnesty, one could not go back to Mexico. One crossed that border, you were not eligible for amnesty. And there was a whole process to go through amnesty, a whole series of steps that really required people to be here in the United States. So now after 86, Mexican immigration, once they come, they tended now much more to stay. Another part of that is obviously increased border security. Now, it became harder to get back into the country in an unauthorized fashion. Yes, there were sanctions on employees, there still are, but they're not enforced very often. And keep in mind, it relies on a good faith effort by the employer, I should say. That should be employers, not employees, to ensure that the person they're employing is an American citizen or authorized to be here. And as one WAG put it, this act was actually a boon to the black market and forged documents. And that happened, where people could simply forge their immigration documents or maybe even citizenship documents and simply give those to employers, and no questions were asked. Clearly, IRCA did not do much to deter unauthorized migration. That was one of the premises of it, but it didn't. 1980 to 2000, the number of Mexican-born people in the United States would grow again pretty explosively. But again, it wasn't just this act. It was also the 1965 that allowed for family reunification. Where again, if you were Mexican American or you were Mexican legal resident, you were eligible to sponsor family members in Mexico to come here. IRCA did the same thing, but the 65 Act did too. So if we look on this chart, here's 1980, Mexican born as a percentage of the United States population. 1980, it's growing, but it's pretty small. By 2000, it's grown explosively. Briefly, since 1986, just a few points we can make. We'll come back to Mexicans being more geographically dispersed in the United States, certainly after 1986, but that was happening as early as the 70s. I'll show you a map in a second. Particularly in the 90s, there were a whole series of acts passed on the state and federal level to combat unauthorized migration. And a lot of them revolved around denying services to people who were here in an unauthorized fashion. Many of those were challenged in the courts. Some were stricken down or discontinued, but nonetheless. If you remember, NAFTA was designed in part to keep Mexicans in Mexico, to keep to curb to some extent both authorized and unauthorized migration to the United States. So the term export goods instead of people. But it really didn't do that. And there was a predecessor program to NAFTA, which was sort of at the center of NAFTA, the Maquiladora program, which was the establishment of a whole bunch of industrial free trade zones in northern Mexico, which were, again, largely meant certainly to develop the Mexican economy, but to keep people from leaving the country. But wages were poor, there weren't enough jobs to go around. So neither NAFTA or the Maquiladora program, which preceded it, ended by any means Mexican migration to the United States. And much of that was simply there were more opportunities. There was much more money to be earned potentially for people leaving Mexico. Corruption, violence, unrest continue to be problems in Mexico. And again, relatively speaking, the United States is relatively free of those things, relative. Another big change is the clout of Mexican-American voters. As early as the 60s, they were a significant group, but today, simply because of their numbers, they're a much larger group. In the 60s, though, they tended to be Democrats. That's changing. If you've been following the news or doing any reading, it's not that simple anymore. An increasing number are affiliating now with the Republican Party. So again, a diversification of political views. And then the infamous border wall, I did a little research there. There's not really a date where that began. As early as FDR's administration or Truman's, there was fencing put up in certain areas, especially where American cities were on the border. But the border wall, as we think of it, really began in earnest after 9/11. Again, security concerns. Part of that was the war on drugs, but part of it was the war on terrorism, too, so-called. So really since 2006, that's been a commonality of every administration's policy towards Mexico, has been continuing this border wall, either expanding it or maintaining it, but not ripping it down. Nobody's done that. Just briefly, just 3 maps to show you the spread of Mexicans within the United States over time. So in 1970, and again, this is where we see Mexico. That indicates in these states, the Mexicans are the largest foreign-born group in the states. So as late as 1970, it's still only those 4 states along the southwest border where they are the largest foreign-born group. By 1990, partly because of the 1965 Immigration Act, partly because of IRCA, they're in many more states in large numbers, especially west of the Mississippi, but even east. And if we look at 2022, they are the majority in most states. The other change you can see between 1970 and 2022, by the way, pretty clearly is in 1970, the largest foreign-born group was either from a European country or from Canada. By 2022, it's either Latin America, primarily Mexico, or it's Asia. And again, that a lot of it was because of the 1965 change in immigration. All right, I've got a few more slides, but I think I want to end here. So we have enough time for questions. And I'd be happy to take any that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Coan. Hold on one moment.